was a truly wonderful discussion, gave us a lot to think about. I now have the honor of presenting our first presenter of the day, Carolyn Cinders. Carolyn is a critical designer and artist. She is the founder of Convocation Design and Research and is currently a research fellow at Weizenbaum Institute. Today, she joins us to define and discuss dark patterns, design choices, and characteristics that trick users into making decisions they normally would not make. So, without further ado, I cede the floor to Carolyn Cinders.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be presenting from one laptop and using my notes on another, so bear with me. But I guess this is how presentations go in a time of COVID. Thank you so much for having me. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for having me here. It is a great honor to be speaking and sharing some work of mine. Let me know if I'm assuming you can say everything, or someone will tell me if you can't. So thank you so much for the introduction. I'm a designer and researcher and a critical designer. Critical design is the methodology of removing capitalism and the traditional constraints of product design, and then seeing what sort of new imaginaries and futures can we create. Then using product design, UX, UI as these facilitation methods to create new imaginaries and futures. Within that, though, I'm also interested in looking at how design impacts policy and then vice versa. As a researcher, I've worked with groups like the Wikimedia Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation, Facebook, Google, Intel, as well as others, and specifically in looking at how design either mitigates or amplifies things like harassment online. Moving forward, even within that, as a design practitioner, I'm well-versed in how to create products, in the study of user experience design, as well as design research. And within that, I've been looking at different things called dark patterns, which is a very popular term, and that is what this presentation will be focusing on. So how does design impact policy? Well, this is a question I often ask in tandem with other questions, along with how can we curb technology's harm in society. And I think design is a big part of this. Design has been impacting policy for years, even if the conversation right now is sort of focused on dark patterns. We can look at, for example, the creation of the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, which effectively is also design regulation, if you will, as well as even things like how the FDA in the United States determines how calorie or ingredient information is displayed. These are just two examples of design impacting policy. But as a designer, I think we need something that goes even further, where we talk about design policy. So combining the study of design with understanding how UX design in a digital space will impact varying forms of digital policy. So design policy high level looks at the role of design in products and software, with the understanding of how designers make things, since there is a criticality in education and a flow to that. If we look at how design culture and design trends dictate the aesthetic roles of design, as well as design education around things like accessibility and standards when we build from mobile to web, etc. All of those things have varying forms of standardization and knowledge tied to it. So design policy is sort of taking that understanding of how products are literally made in terms of software or hardware, and then where policy will impact that. So user experience design, for example, is what makes technology usable and accessible. So for example, iOS follows flat design principles for mobile, and Android follows something called material design. And most digital design follows the principles of human-centered design, a design methodology created in the 1990s that focuses on these concepts of user experience. And these methodologies, for example, are actually somewhat global. It's how a person in Croatia can use an app designed in India and understand how the app is used, or how to use the app without having to read any instructions. So any piece of software you touch, or hardware, including these little devices, is pulling from these themes of human-centered design. So design policy is the act of using design to understand, or rather to make policies around software and hardware either more understandable or understand how design directly impacts policy, which is where we get to something called dark patterns. In 2019, ProPublica reported that TurboTax was suppressing its a free version of a tax software used in the United States. And it was tricking people into paying to filing their taxes. That same year, Princeton University launched a project that discovered over 1,000 different instances of similar tricks that were being implemented across e-commerce websites. These are what designer Harry Bringel calls dark patterns, a term he created in 2010 to describe design choices and characteristics that trick users into making decisions they wouldn't normally make. It's important to point out is dark patterns can be purposeful or accidental, though it's often hard to determine the intent behind them. For example, is it an intentional dark pattern to suppress privacy when social networks design or bury their security settings, or are designers and engineers just not sure where to place the appropriate buttons? Is it intentional that marketplaces like Amazon have price confusion, or again, is this accidentally bad design? In 2019, a few US senators tried to create legislation to ban some forms of dark patterns, though this bill ultimately failed. What matters here is not unpacking direct intent, but rather looking at the outcomes and harms of these design decisions and then creating policies that can account for those decisions, or at least this is my argument. I believe design can be an equalizing action that distills code and policy into understandable interfaces. And what do I mean about that? It's important to realize that design is a utilitarian intelligence that's taking engineering, code, and policy and creating something that feels understandable as well as interactive or tangible to users. So design can both elevate and obfuscate choices and policy. And it's important here to emphasize design isn't just a skill, but a practice and a language in and of itself. And so to start solving problems around these complex issues, design does need to be a part of a conversation when we're thinking of policy and regulation in software spaces. Because design in some cases is what is taking code and policy and again, making it understandable and tangible for users. Design is that thing. So for issues like labor, harassment, security, privacy, and others, design is important. And we can see this perhaps most clearly in this example. How does design translate policy? Online harassment reporting is a fantastic example. Users don't have to understand deeply a social network's policy on harassment in order to report. Instead, they're presented with these choices. Design then also takes the technical infrastructure, which is how that software was built. So the ability to select a piece of content, to click on it, to then click what kind of harassment it is, as well as the political infrastructure, what kind of harm or harassment that content is, and where it sort of falls into a policy bucket, and then fold those into the processes of product design, which is building this harassment reporting. So what's important about this is a user doesn't have to be a security expert or understand perhaps, or a policy expert to be able to file a harassment report. And this is just an example. There are, we could get into deeper flaws of harassment reporting, but this is what I mean by saying how design will often translate code and policy into something else, something that is tangible for a user. Security settings are another great example. So for a user to report content, they shouldn't have to be a lawyer just to adjust security settings, and they shouldn't have to be an engineer. Design helps makes these complexities understandable to everyday people. And it's important because if we high level think about it as a rough set of rules that outline or govern how things work, then design is often taking those policies and either translating them or creating metaphors into other things when they're placed into interfaces. So design is translating the policy at times into interfaces, and that can be choices for users to select from. And this is where we need to understand how design functions if we're going to be creating these different kinds of disclosures, interstitials, or even thoughts around like consent-based choices for users. And this is where dark patterns and design policy go hand in hand. So design policy should, in theory, alleviate dark patterns. But some of the deeper issues with dark patterns is how relatively unknown these are for for a variety of policymakers. Sebastian Reiger, the head of communication for Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, hypothesized in an essay I was writing that Whether it's in the US or Germany, there is still little research available on dark patterns because for a long time they did not cause a lot of damage. This has changed in the past few years. Today, across many industries, companies are using digital design practices that harm consumers, erode privacy, and harm competition. Design patterns have been focused on in larger general press publication articles, even though designers, at least from when I was working as a designer, have known of dark patterns for years. Reiger points out that this could be dark patterns have started to cause more serious widespread damage, for example, filing taxes or implementations in the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. And roughly, the GDPR primarily aims to give control to individuals over their personal data and also provide a unified regulatory environment for companies across the EU bloc. But why are we talking about GDPR and dark patterns? Because it's a great example, one of design policy and another of dark patterns. And think about this for a second. GDPR is what we would call a wicked design problem in the design world, something that's really thorny and difficult to unpack. Because GDPR has to take privacy settings cookies and create user consent flows in a way that is understandable to users, but also has to provide ways that clearly provide opt-in and opt-out and not slow down users when they're trying to engage with content. So GDPR is about this much bigger issue. How do we design for user consent and transparency in products, even particularly in ad tracking, which is quite a complex problem and quite a big deal. And since GDPR has been implemented, it's been radically misinterpreted across platforms and news sites. And I'm going to show you some different examples from things I've taken from 2019 until the present. So early on, I think I took this about a year ago, Fox News didn't even have a GDPR disclosure. Something to point out is I was taking all these screenshots based in Germany in clean browsers and incognito windows. So I was actively looking for an instance that would often trigger a GDPR incognito and making sure my location was readable in Germany. Here's another example. So this is something that different research groups and think tanks would probably argue is not following GDPR because there's only the accept button here. And so this is not consensual at all if the choice is either accept the ad tracking chosen by Harper's Bazaar or not read the website. And this was taken in May 2019. But then in April 2020, or a few months before April 2020 when the screenshot was taken, they updated it to this kind of interstitial for GDPR. And I would argue that this is still a dark pattern. And we can argue that it's still a dark pattern because of the multiple steps it took to get to this interstitial screen. This screen is the one that is most legible to users and is more clearly defining what are all of the different choices. And let's go back just for one quick second so you can see. Cookie settings here is what's functioning as the button, but accept all cookies is what looks more legible and readable to a user. It pops out of the page. And this is what I mean that this is a dark pattern, because this is where the, once you click on cookie settings, this is really where the accept and reject buttons lie. What we have here is called a content strategy dark pattern, where language and design create misinterpretations. It's important to note that maybe this example, when we go forward and see the cookie settings and accept all cookies, could technically fulfill the requirements of GDPR. However, it fails in terms of being usable or legible because of the confusion it creates for users on how to opt out, since it only looks like there's one option really on this page, even though there is two. Is cookie settings understandable as direct all or reject all? No. And this is where content and copy, which is how you write for products and software, needs to be understandable, legible, and written in plain language so users can understand the choices that are being presented. And just here is a very straightforward example. You see how the buttons are the same size and hierarchy and color. One of the big issues I see right now in the gap between civil society and corporate tech in design is the sort of lack of understanding of design and how it's utilized in terms of building software and products. There are a lot of ethics guides or outlines for better tech, but they don't actually explain how to manifest suggestions for designers. And I think GDPR is a fantastic example of that. And there's a lot of policy trying to combat harm, trying to protect users' privacy, which we also need. But again, it's not taking into account how that policy will be misinterpreted or interpreted of everyday employees inside of big tech, like designers. I think it's time for policy teams, think tanks, CSOs, and researchers to engage with designers in the same ways we engage with technologists and engineers, and how they are welcome into different kinds of tech research. Because again, design can unintentionally shift, mask, and hide policy, as well as the intentions of that policy. And if we can start to incorporate design findings into policy, then I think we stand a better chance in terms of understanding and regulating things like dark patterns more specifically, because there's so much more research to be done, especially in the policy space, around looking at and analyzing dark patterns and their impact in different kinds of domains, be it e-commerce, social networks, etc. And again, one thing to highlight is in these spaces, we may have to, a dark pattern may manifest in an e-commerce site that's negative, and that same pattern, which is actually a design pattern, may be a positive in another space. This is where I mean we need a nuanced understanding of how design functions and how it impacts different kinds of products. And lastly, here is just one last example of a dark pattern. This is one where I think we could potentially argue the intent. This is on Vimeo. And as one scrolls down, you finally see this bottom one, which says continue with basic. That is a button, even though it was very clearly, and one could argue, intentionally designed to be unreadable and to look like plain text. It doesn't read to a user as a button. And this is what I mean in terms of how nefarious or impactful design can be in terms of misrepresenting information to users. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That was such an intriguing presentation. So we will now take